coming at you from Washington, D.C. Now, we're very excited to be here with our correspondent, our special correspondent from the Key Post and TVP world, Jason J. Smart. It's good to finally see you in the flesh, and we are here in Washington, D.C., so I'm hoping to get some of your commentaries on American politics, Washington's diplomatic strategy when it comes to the Ukraine situation. Now, first of all, a very crucial thing that we know Washington is facing another partial governmental shutdown in 3 days if no resolution has come. And I'm hoping if you can tell us how this came to be and to what extent this might affect the war effort in Ukraine.
Well, realistically, we have to understand what's going on right now for Ukraine's support in the United States is that there's been a large shift. The Republicans tend to view it as an issue associated with Biden. So unfortunately, there is a faction in the Republican Party that thinks that they're doing damage to Biden by not giving aid to Ukraine. And they will justify this to the taxpayers by saying, look, it's billions of dollars that now we'll spend here in America in our congressional districts, and so it will not be spent far away on Biden's project in Ukraine. The obvious downside of that is, well, Ukraine loses, and U.S. as a strategic partner globally is going to be diminished. So ultimately, this is against U.S. interest, but there are a number of congressmen that don't see this obvious fact.
Right, but for people who are kind of not seeing that as an obvious fact, can you help us understand why maybe these concerns about spending is not as substantial as they make it out to be?
Sure. So if we put this into context, how much aid has U.S. given to Ukraine? It works out to about 3.5% of the total U.S. defense budget. But even smaller than the 3.5% for the U.S. defense budget is that this represents about 0.3% of the total U.S. budget. So for 0.3% of the total U.S. budget of assistance that's been given to Ukraine, Ukraine has destroyed about 50% of the Russian military. And if we consider that this is America's longtime nemesis, Russia, that is being set back and destroyed through this assistance, it's obviously, to quote Senator Graham, the best investment of U.S. tax dollars for U.S. national security in the history of our country.
All right, so we are unfortunately still at a gridlock when it comes to this bipartisanship, when it comes to the partial shutdown of government. So if that indeed takes place, how would that affect a lot of the budgetary things and, more importantly, the war effort in Ukraine?
So there'll be a couple different effects. If we're to go through and the Congress does not give more assistance to Ukraine and there's not some sort of a deal made, in 3 days what we will see is that immediately all assistance that is going to Ukraine will stop. Anything that was not pre-programmed before this will be stopped because there's no future outlays. It also means all federal facilities close down, whether it's the national parks or anything else. But more to that point, we would see that the federal employees themselves would be forced to sit home without a job because simply their salaries have not been improved by the Congress. This would be extremely detrimental to Ukraine, though, specific to that point. Ukraine, without any sort of assistance, without any further weapons being sent or any financial assistance, would be left completely behind. And that's something that we can be absolutely certain Russia is hoping on. So those Republicans who are taking the side that is in the interest of Russia should be clear that the fact is they're not working in America's interest, they're working in Russia's interest.
And do you believe that any sort of compromise could be reached within the next, let's say, 72 hours in order for that not to take place?
So the Senate did find a compromise yesterday, which does give us hope that somehow in the House, a compromise could also be reached. Now, Speaker McCarthy, the top Republican, has already asked for meetings with President Biden in order to discuss what's going on, to see if there's some sort of way they can work things out. But we have to be clear is that McCarthy has his own interest here. If he were to do something that's vastly unpopular with the Republican base, he could face a leadership crisis where the Republican Party itself, or Republican members of Congress, push to have him removed from his position. So he's keen to promote that and to maintain that, but it's going to be very difficult given the current situation.
All right, so like you mentioned, there is unfortunately a lot of kind of bipartisanship in there. Partisanship in there. A lot of Republicans seeing this as a hit to Biden, and instead of like thinking it in terms of American interests. Do you think these kind of concerns are founded, and especially when it comes, we're talking about the election looming and the possibility of a Ukrainian war fatigue? How substantial do you think that is in the Republican Party, or do you think it's mostly just election-driven and not really like that deep when it comes to kind of trying to pull back the aid for Ukraine?
Well, realistically, yes, it does. There is a degree here that it's war fatigue. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that this is because of the elections. The reason the Republicans are making a big deal of this now is because Ukraine is so associated with the Biden administration. But more to that point, I think that it's important to note that Ukraine historically has had a couple of problems in the U.S. One of the impeachments of Donald Trump was related to Ukraine. Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was involved in businesses in Ukraine. So Ukraine has had political scandals associated with the United States before. And so that's a very easy tool for Republicans to use in this election cycle to try to make Ukraine seem less like a vital ally to the United States.
All right, and speaking of Ukraine's diplomatic efforts, we also see President Zelensky going on a diplomatic offensive. So I was wondering if you can give us your take on how he's been doing so far, and do you think his efforts will be able to garner some support or maybe at least pull back from these kind of partisan divide?
Well, it's important for Ukraine and any country to avoid all this partisanship. I mean, the fact is, Ukraine doesn't want to get involved in inside baseball. There's huge risk associated with that, and very little that can stand really to gain. Ukraine has to present itself, though, in a different way. It can no longer assume that people in the United States or elsewhere understand why it's important to assist Ukraine. It has to be explained why to assist Ukraine and how ultimately that makes, for instance, America safer. That is directly in America's interest to help Ukraine to defeat Russia. And so if that argument's made better, and they understand that, if Russia's strengthened, that will only give China more reason to believe that Taiwan will not be offended by the United States. The best thing we could do if we're worried about Taiwan is to defend Ukraine. That will have a direct link. In the same way, we know that Iran is giving drones to Russia, which they're testing new technology all the time, and they actually released a new one yesterday. Well, this is going to be bad for Israeli security. This is bad for a number of different countries, different allies of the United States, if we are allowing Russia to be empowered and to continue waging war and not to give further assistance to Ukraine.
All right, and speaking of the looming election, we know that it's not only the United States that is going to have their election soon. And we also see Poland, we see Slovakia going to have their elections, and Ukraine is, of course, on the topic. Do you think that the domestic policy of these countries and their effort to get re-elected might change their diplomatic outlook when it comes to the support of Ukraine?
Yes, I mean, absolutely it could be the case. I mean, fortunately, in Europe, I think that there continues to be very strong support for Ukraine, and the major political parties realize the threat of Russia for them, especially the Eastern Bloc countries. Russia's a real threat. This is not something that's a hypothetical far away. This is a country that has directly worked against the interests of the peoples living in Eastern Europe historically. And so I think there's a much stronger argument that can be made in the case of Eastern Europe than can be made in the United States, which is so much further away from this conflict.
All right, and speaking of Poland, and we are in, of course, Washington, D.C., I'm also wondering if there's a lot of interest when it comes to a coming election in Poland. And also, what do you think Washington's take will be when it comes to the discussion of the agricultural product, especially the grain controversy that's currently happening, this feud between Poland and Ukraine?
In the case of the Ukraine and Poland and the recent feud they've been having, I really do think that will be something that's paved over. I don't think that's going to be a long-term problem. It's not strategic for Ukraine, most certainly, and so I don't think this is something that they will continue to insist upon. Now, I do think, that being said, Poland, like every other country, it is also grown tired of the constant war, and so Ukraine has to do more than simply expect people to help for free, expect people to do more assistance. They have to make the case of how this is somehow helpful to Poland and to the Polish people as well. Understand that there's great appreciation for the assistance that's been given, and it's not being demanded by Kiev, but it's simply being appreciated greatly by Kiev that it's being given willfully by these other countries.
All right, so last but not least, of course, a lot of this discussion is involved around partisan divide when it comes to the support of Ukraine. Do you think there's any kind of diplomatic maneuver that Zelensky can take right now in order to garner support, maybe from the other side of the aisle, meaning Republicans in the States or people basically that's still looking down a political divide in order to kind of sway their minds?
So, I mean, in the short term, it's going to be difficult because there's only 3 days left. So time is quite short. That being said, I think that in the long term, Ukraine would definitely benefit from having professional lobbyists. The fact is the United States runs on lobbyism. To give you an idea, an Israeli lobby itself spends about $1 million per quarter. Azerbaijan spends about $700,000 per quarter. Almost every country has a lobby in Washington, D.C., and there's a reason for it. It's effective. And that's something Ukraine should pursue. But in the very short term, I think that Ukraine should make clear to Americans and American decision makers that the assistance that they're giving is something that will pay off, not just in the security, but there will be a rebuilding of Ukraine. and the countries that have helped the most Ukraine now, during this very trying period, will be those countries that could take the most benefit of the rebuilding. And that rebuilding is something that will create American jobs ultimately.
Right. Thank you so much for all your input and insight and helping us dissect this situation, and really appreciate it. Thanks again for being with us.